A hush fell over the crowd as the woman in the foreign military uniform stepped forward, her polished boots clicking against the centuries-old stones of Buckingham Palace. She squared her shoulders, stared directly at the immobile British guard, and barked with commanding authority. "You will salute me now, Sergeant. That's an order." What happened next silenced everyone. Even the embassy officials didn't see it coming. The air that morning was brisk, laced with the fresh scent of spring blossoms and the distant hum of ceremonial brass warming up. The golden tips of Buckingham Palace glimmered under the rising sun as the Union Jack waved lightly in the breeze above. Tourists flocked to the gates, snapping photos and marveling at the changing of the guard ceremony about to take place. But among the crowd was someone who didn't come to admire tradition. She came to test it. Lieutenant General Patricia Horoho of the United States Army was not a woman known for diplomacy. At 58, she was a career military officer forged in the demanding corridors of military medicine and hardened by decades of bureaucratic battles within the Pentagon. With sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an even sharper tongue, Horoho carried herself like the embodiment of American military efficiency. She had served as the 43rd Surgeon General of the United States Army, commanded field hospitals in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now represented her country in an exclusive NATO Medical Readiness Summit hosted by the United Kingdom. Her reputation preceded her wherever she went. Those who had worked under her command described her as brilliant but demanding, innovative yet inflexible when it came to military protocol. She had revolutionized battlefield medicine, saved countless lives through her administrative reforms, and earned the grudging respect of her peers. But she had also accumulated a reputation for confrontational behavior when she believed military courtesy was being ignored. The delegation had arrived at Heathrow at 0600 hours, transferred immediately to sleek black vehicles escorted by British security and palace protocol officials. Horoho stepped out of the lead car stiffly, her uniform immaculate, every ribbon and star precisely positioned. She scanned the palace grounds with what could only be described as professional assessment, mixed with barely concealed disdain. "Impressive architecture," she muttered to her aide, Colonel Marcus Chen, a soft-spoken Asian-American officer who had served as her chief of staff for 3 years. "But all this ceremonial pomp reminds me of a museum exhibit. Where's the operational efficiency?" Colonel Chen didn't reply immediately. He had learned that Horoho's rhetorical questions were better left unanswered, especially when she was in what he privately called her evaluation mode. Instead, he consulted his tablet, reviewing the day's schedule. "Ma'am, we have the palace tour at 0930, followed by the medical readiness briefing at 1100, lunch with the Royal Army Medical Corps at 1300, and the ceremonial guard change at 1500. Horoho nodded curtly, but her attention had already shifted to something else entirely. Her gaze had fallen on the iconic red-coated figure guarding the palace gates, a ceremonial royal guard, still, expressionless, immovable. Sergeant Thomas Blackwood stood at his post, bearing the traditional scarlet tunic and bearskin hat with flawless posture. His eyes stared ahead, fixed and unwavering. To the average onlooker, he appeared like a relic of the past, a living statue maintaining centuries-old traditions. But to those who knew his file, Sergeant Blackwood was anything but decorative. At 32 years old, with a decade of distinguished service behind him, Blackwood had completed 2 tours in Helmand Province, 1 deployment in Mali, and had served as liaison to Special Operations Forces during classified engagements that would never appear in his official record. He had been awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross for actions during a Taliban ambush that saved the lives of 6 wounded soldiers, though he never spoke of it. The medal sat in his quarters, rarely looked at, never displayed. To Blackwood, standing still was not inactivity. It was discipline in its purest form. During his tours in Afghanistan, he had learned that survival often depended not on action, but on the wisdom to know when not to act. He had spent 18 hours motionless in a sniper's nest, waiting for the perfect shot that would eliminate a high-value target. He had maintained radio silence for 3 days behind enemy lines, communicating only through predetermined hand signals with his unit. His current posting at Buckingham Palace was considered by many to be a ceremonial reward, a peaceful assignment after years of combat. But Blackwood knew better. Every day, thousands of people from around the world observed him, tested him, tried to provoke reactions. Foreign dignitaries, drunk tourists, attention-seeking social media influencers, all believed they could break his composure. None had succeeded. The training for the Queen's Guard was rigorous, both physically and mentally. Guards practiced standing motionless for hours, learning to ignore distractions, weather, fatigue, and provocation. They studied crowd psychology, threat assessment, and diplomatic protocol. They were taught to differentiate between harmless curiosity and genuine security concerns, to respond appropriately to each situation while maintaining the dignity of their position. Blackwood had excelled in this training, partly because of his combat experience, but mostly because of his natural temperament. He possessed what his commanding officers called unshakable calm, the ability to remain centered, regardless of external pressures. This quality had made him invaluable in combat situations and equally valuable in his current role. As the NATO delegation gathered outside the East Wing to begin their guided tour, Horoho's attention kept drifting back to the ceremonial guard. Edward Mallory, the appointed palace coordinator, began his narration with charming elegance, describing the history of the courtyard, the origins of the Queen's Guard, and the architectural legacy of the palace. The tradition of the Royal Guards dates back to 1660, Mallory explained to the assembled group, when King Charles II established the first regiments following his restoration to the throne. The ceremonial uniform you see today has remained virtually unchanged for over 350 years, representing an unbroken chain of service to the crown. Most of the delegation nodded respectfully, taking notes and asking polite questions about the historical significance of various architectural features. Horoho, however, seemed more interested in conducting her own assessment of the security arrangements. "Mr. Mallory," she interrupted, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "What's the operational readiness status of these ceremonial guards? Are they trained for actual security threats, or are they purely decorative?" Mallory paused, clearly unused to such direct questioning during what was typically a straightforward historical presentation. "Well, General Horoho, the guards are all active duty soldiers who have completed extensive training. They are fully capable of responding to security situations while maintaining their ceremonial duties." "I see," Horoho replied, her tone suggesting skepticism. She gestured toward Blackwood. "And that particular guard, what's his combat experience? Has he seen actual deployment, or has he spent his career standing still for tourists?" Colonel Chen stepped closer to his superior, sensing the tension building in her voice. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "perhaps we should continue with the scheduled tour." But Horoho was no longer listening to her aide. She had fixated on what she perceived as a fundamental contradiction. How could someone be considered a real soldier while performing what appeared to be an elaborate pantomime? In her worldview, shaped by decades of military medicine where every second could mean the difference between life and death, the idea of highly trained personnel standing motionless seemed like a waste of resources. The rest of the delegation had moved on to examine a historical plaque, but Horoho lingered, studying Blackwood with the intense focus she typically reserved for complex medical procedures. She noted his breathing pattern, his posture, the way his eyes tracked movement in his peripheral vision without turning his head. Despite her skepticism, she had to admit there was something undeniably professional about his bearing. Captain James Rowley, supervisor of the Royal Guard Watch that day, had been monitoring the situation from a discreet distance. Tall and composed, With 20 years of service and an innate ability to read people, he had dealt with challenging visitors before, but something about the American general's body language concerned him. He approached the group casually, carrying his clipboard and maintaining the friendly but professional demeanor expected of palace staff. "Good morning," he said, addressing the delegation collectively while keeping his attention focused on Horoho. "I'm here to ensure your visit proceeds smoothly. Are there any questions about the ceremony or protocols I can answer?" Horoho turned to face him, and Rowley immediately recognized the look in her eyes, the expression of someone accustomed to command, who was evaluating whether she was being treated with appropriate respect. "Captain," she said, "I was just wondering about the practical military value of having trained soldiers stand perfectly still for hours. In my experience, effective. Security requires alertness, mobility, and the ability to respond rapidly to changing situations." Rowley chose his words carefully. "That's an excellent observation, General. What you're seeing is actually a highly specialized form of security work. Our guards are trained to maintain complete situational awareness while appearing motionless. They can detect threats, communicate with security teams, and respond appropriately without breaking their ceremonial bearing. And if I were to approach that guard over there," Horoho said, nodding toward Blackwood, "he would simply ignore me, even though I outrank him significantly?" "Ma'am," Rowley replied, his tone remaining respectful but becoming more formal. "The guards are understanding orders not to engage with visitors unless there's a direct security threat. This applies regardless of the visitor's rank or background. It's not a matter of disrespect. It's a matter of following protocol that has been established for very good reasons." Horoho's expression hardened slightly. "Protocol is important, Captain, but so is basic military courtesy. Where I come from, failure to acknowledge a superior officer is considered a serious breach of discipline. And where we stand now, General," Rowley replied firmly, "our guards answer to the Crown while in uniform. They follow British military protocol, which may differ from what you're accustomed to in other contexts." The conversation had attracted the attention of other delegation members, including Colonel Chen, who moved closer to his general's side. Edward Mallory also approached, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the discussion was taking. "Perhaps," Mallory suggested diplomatically, "we could continue the tour and discuss military protocols during the formal briefing session later this morning." But Horoho wasn't ready to let the matter drop. "I appreciate your concern for protocol, gentlemen, but I think there's value in understanding how these procedures work in practice." She looked directly at Blackwood, who continued to stare straight ahead, apparently oblivious to the conversation taking place 15 feet away from his post. Without warning, Horoho separated herself from the group and walked directly toward Sergeant Blackwood. Her movement was deliberate, authoritative, the stride of someone accustomed to having her presence acknowledged and her commands obeyed. "General Horoho," Mallory called after her, his voice carrying a note of alarm. "If you please, this area requires maintaining a respectful distance from the guards." She ignored him. Instead, she positioned herself directly in front of Blackwood, close enough that her shadow fell across his polished boots. Up close, she could see the precision of his uniform, the steadiness of his breathing, the absolute stillness of his expression. "Sergeant," she said, her voice clear and carrying the unmistakable tone of military command. "I am Lieutenant General Patricia Horoho of the United States Army. I am addressing you directly." No response. Blackwood's eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond her left shoulder, his expression unchanged. Horoho waited for several seconds, then stepped to her right, attempting to position herself in his direct line of sight. "I am addressing you, Sergeant. Basic military protocol requires acknowledgement of a superior officer." Still no response. Blackwood's breathing remained steady, his posture perfect, his gaze unwavering. Captain Rowley had followed Horoho and now stood at what he considered a safe intervention distance. "General," he said firmly, Sergeant Blackwood is following standing. Order 157, Section 3. He is not permitted to engage, respond, or acknowledge any individual unless there is a direct and immediate threat to palace security. Horoho turned toward Rowley, her frustration becoming more visible. So you're telling me that even if the President of the United States walked up to this man, he would simply ignore him? That is correct, ma'am, Rowley replied without hesitation. And you consider this appropriate military behavior? I consider it following orders, which is the foundation of military discipline in any army. The exchange had drawn the attention of nearby tourists, some of whom had begun recording with their phones. A small crowd was forming, sensing drama, but not yet understanding its nature. Colonel Chen approached his superior. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we have a full schedule today. Perhaps we should rejoin the group." But Horoho was studying Blackwood with renewed intensity. She walked slowly around his position, examining him from different angles like a scientist, observing a specimen. "Remarkable," she said, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Perfect stillness, even when directly challenged by a superior officer. Either this man has extraordinary discipline, or he's simply been trained to ignore reality." Blackwood's expression didn't change, but Captain Rowley noticed the almost imperceptible shift in the guard's weight distribution, a subtle adjustment that indicated heightened alertness without visible movement. "I'll tell you what, Sergeant," Horoho said, returning to stand directly in front of Blackwood. "I'm going to give you one more opportunity to demonstrate proper military courtesy. I am Lieutenant General Horoho, and I am ordering you to acknowledge my presence." She waited, studying his face for any sign of response. When none came, she continued. "In the United States Army, failure to respond to a direct order from a general officer would result in immediate disciplinary action. What kind of military allows its soldiers to simply ignore their superiors?" Edward Mallory stepped forward, clearly distressed. "General, I must insist that you step back. You are violating established protocol, and this behavior could have diplomatic consequences." "Diplomatic consequences?" Horoho laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "For expecting basic military professionalism? I think your priorities are backwards, Mr. Mallory." She turned back to Blackwood, who had not moved despite the increasingly tense conversation taking place around him. "You know what I think, Sergeant. I think you can hear every word I'm saying. I think you understand exactly what's happening here, and I think you're choosing to hide behind your pretty red uniform instead of demonstrating real military bearing." Captain Rowley moved closer, his voice becoming more authoritative. "General Horoho, I need to ask you to step away from the guard immediately. Your behavior is becoming disruptive, and if it continues, I'll be forced to contact security." "Contact? Security?" Horoho's voice rose slightly. "Captain, I am the security. I've commanded field hospitals under enemy fire, managed medical operations during active combat, and supervised the evacuation of wounded soldiers under conditions you can't imagine. Don't lecture me about disruption." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and phones were now openly recording the confrontation. Several tourists whispered to each other in various languages, clearly understanding that something significant was happening even if they couldn't follow all the details. Colonel Chen made another attempt to defuse the situation. "General, with respect, this isn't about your qualifications or your service record. It's about respecting British protocols while we're guests in their country." But Horoho was beyond diplomatic considerations. Her focus had narrowed to what she perceived as a fundamental challenge to military authority. In her mind, Blackwood's silence wasn't discipline. It was insubordination disguised as tradition. What happened next would be analyzed and debated for months afterward. Security footage from multiple angles would be examined by military analysts, diplomatic experts, and behavioral psychologists. But in the moment, it seemed to unfold in slow motion. Horoho stepped closer to Blackwood, reducing the distance between them to less than 2 feet. "Sergeant," she said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her authority, "you are being directly addressed by a general officer. You will respond, or you will face the consequences of your insubordination." She waited 10 seconds, counting them off audibly. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. When Blackwood still didn't respond, Horoho reached out and placed her hand firmly on his left shoulder. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and audible, a collective gasp that seemed to echo off the palace walls. Everyone present, from British citizens to foreign tourists, understood instinctively that a line had been crossed. The rule was simple and universal: you do not touch the Queen's guard. But Blackwood didn't move. Not yet. Horoho's hand remained on his shoulder for several seconds, her grip firm, her expression a mixture of triumph and challenge. "There," she said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "Now you've been physically contacted by a superior officer. What are you going to do about it?" Captain Rowley was already moving, speaking rapidly into his radio. "Security to the West Gate. Code Yellow. Immediate response required." Edward Mallory looked pale. "General Horoho, you must remove your hand immediately. This is a serious breach of protocol that could have what?" Horoho interrupted, her hand still on Blackwood's shoulder. "Could expose the fact that your supposedly disciplined soldier is actually just a man in a costume who's been trained to ignore his duties." And then Sergeant Thomas Blackwood moved. It was subtle at first, so controlled that many in the crowd missed it entirely. Blackwood's left hand, which had been perfectly positioned at his side, shifted slightly, just enough to create space near the rifle slung across his chest. His weight redistributed almost imperceptibly, his stance adjusting by perhaps an inch. Then, in one fluid motion that demonstrated years of training and natural precision, he stepped forward half a pace and raised his white-gloved left hand. The movement wasn't aggressive or dramatic. It was simply efficient. A crisp, angled motion that intercepted Horoho's wrist and gently but firmly removed her hand from his shoulder. The crowd fell completely silent. "Ma'am," Blackwood said, his voice low, controlled, and carrying the unmistakable accent of someone educated in Britain's finest military traditions, "you are in breach of Standing Order 157. Physical interference with an active royal guard constitutes a Category B security infraction." Horoho blinked, clearly startled. She had expected continued silence or perhaps some form of defensive reaction. She had not expected a response that sounded like a formal legal proceeding delivered with military precision. Blackwood continued, his eyes now focused directly on hers, his voice steady and professional. "As per Palace Directive 147, issued by the Ministry of Defense and enforced by Royal Command, no individual, regardless of diplomatic or military status, has authority over a guard on ceremonial duty. You have now violated this protocol." The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then Horoho laughed, not with amusement, but with the sharp, bitter sound of someone who felt cornered and refused to admit defeat. "Unbelievable," she said, shaking her head. "One touch, and suddenly the entire British Empire comes alive to defend its toy soldiers." "General," Captain Rowley said, approaching with obvious urgency, "you need to step away immediately. This situation has escalated beyond acceptable limits." But Horoho wasn't finished. The fact that Blackwood had finally responded seemed to energize, rather than discourage her. "So you can speak," she said to the guard. "You can move. You can act. But only when it suits your precious protocols." She looked around at the crowd, many of whom were still recording. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're witnessing the difference between real military discipline and theatrical performance. This man just proved he's been choosing to ignore military courtesy, not following orders." Blackwood's expression remained neutral, but something in his voice grew steadier, more confident. "Ma'am, with respect, ignoring provocation is not the same as lacking awareness. Standing still under pressure is a skill that requires considerable training and discipline. Standing still, Horoho repeated mockingly, is not a military skill. It's performance art. I disagree, ma'am, Blackwood replied calmly. Combat experience teaches you that sometimes the most difficult action is taking no action at all. Sometimes discipline means holding position even when every instinct tells you to move. Before Horoho could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? Colonel James Bradford of the British Army, head of International Military Coordination, approached through the crowd with the measured stride of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. Older, composed, and clearly someone who had dealt with diplomatic incidents before, he assessed the scene quickly and accurately. Behind him walked two additional figures, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the palace's senior security liaison, and Major David Thornton, who served as the official military attaché for high-ranking foreign visitors. Lieutenant General Horoho, Colonel Bradford said, his tone perfectly professional but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. I'm Colonel Bradford. I understand there's been some confusion about our ceremonial protocols. Horoho turned. To face the new arrivals, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed to recognize that the situation had evolved beyond her control. Colonel Bradford, I was simply attempting to establish basic military courtesy with your guard here. Where I come from, soldiers acknowledge superior officers. And where you stand now, General, Bradford replied evenly, our protocols take precedence. Sergeant Blackwood was following his orders precisely as they were given to him. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone who had been monitoring the situation from a distance. General Horoho, I've been observing this interaction for the past several minutes. Our security protocols are quite clear about physical contact with guards, and they apply to all visitors regardless of rank or nationality. Major Thornton consulted his own device before speaking. Ma'am, I should inform you that this incident is being recorded by palace security systems as well as multiple civilian devices. Given your official status and the nature of this visit, any continuation of this confrontation could have significant diplomatic implications. Horoho looked around, perhaps for the first time fully aware of the crowd that had gathered and the phones pointed in her direction. Colonel Chen stepped closer to her, his expression conveying urgent concern. General, he said quietly, we should return to the scheduled program. The medical readiness briefing begins in 30 minutes, and the Royal Army Medical Corps representatives are waiting. But Horoho's attention had returned to Blackwood, who had resumed his original position but remained visibly alert. Sergeant, she said, you mentioned combat experience. Where did you serve? For a moment it seemed Blackwood might not respond. Then he said simply, Afghanistan and Mali, ma'am. 2 tours total. What unit? Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, ma'am. Attached to Special Operations Support. Horoho's expression shifted slightly. As a former Surgeon General, she had worked extensively with Special Operations medical support teams. She knew the caliber of soldiers who earned those assignments. The Princess of Wales Regiment, she repeated thoughtfully. I've treated wounded from that unit. Good soldiers. Yes, ma'am, Blackwood replied. The acknowledgement seemed to create a brief pause in the tension. For perhaps 30 seconds, the confrontation transformed into something resembling a professional military conversation. What was your role in Afghanistan? Horoho asked. Forward observer and liaison, ma'am. Coordinated medical evacuations and provided security for field hospitals during operations. Horoho nodded slowly. Dangerous work. How many evacuations? 43 confirmed, ma'am. Estimated casualty prevention of approximately 200 personnel. The number clearly impressed her. Medical evacuation coordination required extensive training, quick decision-making under pressure, and the ability to work effectively with multiple military units simultaneously. It was not a role given to inexperienced or unreliable soldiers. "And now you stand at attention for tourists," she said, but the mocking tone had diminished. "Now I serve the Crown in a different capacity, ma'am," Blackwood replied. "Same dedication, different mission parameters." Colonel Bradford seized the opportunity provided by this more civil exchange. "General, perhaps this demonstrates the point we've been trying to make. Sergeant Blackwood's current assignment may appear ceremonial, but it requires the same level of professionalism and discipline he demonstrated in combat situations." Horoho considered this, studying Blackwood with what appeared to be renewed assessment rather than challenge. "Sergeant, when you were coordinating those medical evacuations, did you ever have to maintain position under direct fire?" "Yes, ma'am. Standard procedure for forward observers." "For how long?" "Longest single engagement was approximately 6 hours, ma'am." 6 hours under fire without moving? Movement would have compromised the evacuation routes and endangered the medical teams, ma'am. Horoho fell silent for several moments. As a medical officer, she understood exactly what Blackwood was describing. Forward observers who coordinated medical evacuations often had to remain in exposed positions for extended periods, providing targeting information and maintaining communication links while under enemy fire. It required not just courage, but the kind of disciplined stillness that could mean the difference between successful evacuations and catastrophic casualties. But rather than backing down, Horoho seemed to interpret this information as validation of her original point. "So you are capable of real military performance," she said, "which makes your current behavior even more puzzling." She turned to address the crowd, raising her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man has just confirmed that he's a decorated combat veteran with extensive experience in life and death situations. Yet he's been standing here pretending he couldn't hear me or respond to basic military courtesy. Colonel." Bradford moved closer, his tone becoming more formal. "General Horoho, I need to ask you to conclude this interaction and return to your delegation." "No," she said firmly. "I think there's an important principle at stake here." She looked back at Blackwood. "Sergeant, as a fellow military professional, I'm asking you directly. Do you believe it's appropriate to ignore a superior officer, regardless of the circumstances?" Blackwood considered the question carefully before responding. "Ma'am, I believe it's appropriate to follow the lawful orders of my commanding officers, even when those orders might conflict with other military traditions. And if your commanding officers ordered you to ignore basic military courtesy, then I would follow those orders, ma'am, because I trust that my commanding officers understand the full context of the mission and the requirements for its successful completion." Horoho shook her head. "That's not military discipline, Sergeant. That's blind obedience." "With respect, ma'am, there's a difference between blind obedience and disciplined execution of clear directives. In combat, following orders even when you don't understand the complete tactical picture is often what keeps units alive and missions successful. But this isn't combat, Sergeant. This is a public relations exercise dressed up as military tradition." Blackwood's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried a subtle note of conviction. "Ma'am, every military assignment serves the larger mission of national defense, even assignments that might appear ceremonial. My presence here represents the professionalism and reliability of British forces to allies, adversaries, and civilians from around the world." Major Thornton stepped forward, consulting his tablet with obvious concern. "General Horoho, I need to inform you that this incident is now being broadcast live on several social media platforms. The footage is being shared internationally, and it's likely to attract significant attention from military and diplomatic communities." Horoho looked around at the crowd, many of whom were indeed holding phones and recording devices. For the first time, she seemed to fully grasp the potential consequences of the confrontation. Colonel Chen moved to her side. "Ma'am, We need to consider the impact this might have on the Medical Readiness Summit and on broader US-UK military cooperation. But rather than retreating, Horoho seemed to double down on her position. "Good," she said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "Let people see what happens when military traditions take precedence over military professionalism." She turned back to Blackwood. "Sergeant, I'm going to ask you one more time, as one military professional to another, to demonstrate appropriate respect for rank and acknowledge my presence with a proper salute." The crowd fell silent again, sensing that the confrontation was reaching some kind of climax. Blackwood looked directly at her for several seconds before responding. "Ma'am, I respectfully decline. My orders are clear, and I intend to follow them. Even though I outrank you significantly. Ma'am, rank relationships apply within chains of command. You are not in my chain of command, and my orders specify that I am not to break bearing for any individual unless there is a direct security threat. And if I make this a direct order, ma'am, you don't have the authority to give me orders. I serve under British command, following British military law and British protocols." Horoho's face flushed slightly. "So, you're hiding behind nationality?" "I'm following my orders, ma'am." What happened next would be replayed countless times on social media, analyzed by military experts, and debated in diplomatic circles for months. Horoho stepped forward again, closer than she had been before, until she was almost touching Blackwood. "Sergeant," she said, her voice carrying the full authority of her rank and years of command. "I am Lieutenant General Patricia Horoho of the United States Army. I have commanded thousands of soldiers, managed billion-dollar budgets, and saved lives in combat zones around the world. You will show me the respect my rank deserves." She paused, staring directly into his eyes. "Salute me now, or I will consider your behavior a deliberate insult to the United States military and to the NATO alliance." The silence stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Blackwood's expression remained calm, professional, unchanged. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I understand your perspective, and I respect your service and your rank, but I cannot and will not break my orders." "Cannot or will not?" "Both, ma'am. My orders are clear, and I believe they serve important purposes that extend beyond this immediate situation." Horoho stared at him for several more seconds, then stepped back slightly. "Fine," she said. "If you won't show proper military courtesy voluntarily, perhaps you'll respond to a more direct approach." Before anyone could react, she reached out and firmly grasped the front of Blackwood's rifle. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The crowd gasped audibly, several people shouted warnings, and Captain Rowley began moving quickly toward the confrontation while speaking urgently into his radio. But Blackwood's response was even more immediate. In one smooth, practiced motion, he stepped back, used his left hand to break her grip on the weapon, and repositioned himself in a stance that clearly indicated defensive readiness while maintaining the dignity of his position. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now carrying unmistakable authority, "you have now committed a serious security violation. Physical interference with a guard's weapon is considered a potential threat to palace security and will result in immediate intervention by security personnel." Horoho looked startled by the speed and efficiency of his response, but she didn't back down. "Threat to security? I'm a general officer in a NATO alliance military." "Ma'am, protocols don't recognize exceptions based on rank or nationality when it comes to weapon security." Captain Rowley reached them, flanked now by two palace security officers in dark suits. "General Horoho," he said, his voice formal and authoritative, "you have violated multiple security protocols. I'm instructing you to step away from the guard immediately and return to your delegation." Colonel Bradford arrived moments later, accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell and several additional security personnel. The situation had clearly escalated beyond diplomatic courtesy into a genuine security incident. "General," Bradford said. "This behavior is unacceptable and potentially dangerous. You will cease this interaction immediately, or we will be forced to treat this as a security breach requiring formal intervention." Horoho looked around, perhaps finally recognizing that she had pushed the situation far beyond any reasonable limits. The crowd had grown substantially. Phones were recording from multiple angles, and she was now surrounded by British military and security personnel who were clearly prepared to take more serious action if necessary. Colonel Chen approached her urgently. "Ma'am, we need to leave immediately. This has gone too far." For a moment, it seemed she might continue the confrontation. Then she looked at Blackwood one more time, her expression a mixture of frustration, anger, and perhaps a grudging recognition of his professionalism. "This isn't over, Sergeant," she said quietly. "I understand, ma'am," Blackwood replied, already returning to his original position. Colonel Bradford stepped forward. "Actually, General, it is over. You'll be escorted back to your vehicle immediately. A full incident report will be filed with both your embassy and your chain of command. Any further disruption will result in your immediate removal from palace grounds and possible detention." The crowd began to disperse as security personnel formed a discreet but unmistakable escort around Horoho and her delegation. As they walked toward the waiting vehicles, conversations buzzed in multiple languages, phones continued recording, and social media posts began appearing in real time. Within hours, video footage of the confrontation had spread across social media platforms worldwide. News organizations picked up the story, military bloggers analyzed every aspect of the interaction, and diplomatic correspondents speculated about the potential impact on USE.